Hello, I'm Bob Starrett, one of the founding members of this website. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the challenges facing humanity in the 21st century. I know that some of what I'm going to talk about is not pleasant, but sweeping unpleasantries under the rug doesn't make them go away. They are just hidden from view, and kicking the can down the road just makes a possible recovery that much more difficult. So there's a lot to talk about. To do this topic justice, a full course could be offered. However, for brevity, I would like to offer just enough to show you so that you can get a real feel of the complexities of the issues I will be describing. So let's get started. So the first thing that I would like to do is share out my computer screen so you can see the presentation. So here we go. Okay. So what we're going to talk about today are four scenarios for humanity's future and the challenges that we face in the 21st century. This is a big picture view, but I hope it'll give you enough of an overview that you get an appreciation for the severity and the types of problems that we will face in the future. So, what is the purpose of this presentation? Firstly, to review the big picture challenges facing civilization in the 21st century. And the second step is to discuss the most likely scenarios and possible outcomes for each scenario that may occur. And why are we doing this? Well, the first step to solving a problem is to understand what you are faced with. If you're oblivious to the nature of the problems, you certainly can't come up with a solution. So at the most optimistic point of view, we have a future where we have increasing standards of living. And by the end of the 21st century, hopefully, we have a harmonious environment between our cities and our environment, lots of green space, higher standard of living, less pollution, and a greater concern for our neighbors. That's the most optimistic future. Most pessimistic future is that we may go the way of the dinosaurs. So, before we can talk about these scenarios, first we have to understand the challenges that we face and the nature of those challenges. So, Peter Drucker, who was a famous American management consultant, who is especially known for the work he did in Japan to recover them from the devastation from World War II, is quoted as saying, trying to predict the future is like trying to drive down a country road at night with no lights on while looking out the back window of the vehicle. So for the last 150 years or so, the past has always been an indicator of what the future holds for us. Continuous increasing standard of living year by year, continuous innovation, technology supplanting manual human labor, and in some case, not necessary, even intellectual labor that's routine and very labor intensive. Uh, Continuing better educational opportunities, longer lifespans, and of course, more leisure times. All of these we came to expect over the last 150 years. However, I'm here to tell you today that the future will not be a linear extrapolation of what has happened today. And the reasons for that should become self-evident as I continue into this presentation. So let's take a look at one canary in the coal mine, property insurance. So why do we buy property insurance? We don't expect property loss and banks, but it's good for peace of mind. And banks wants to insure their investment. It's very difficult to get a mortgage today without having property insurance on the property you're trying to buy. Uh, And of course, in the likely event that some destructive event does occur, our assets are protected and we can repair and rebuild, and the bank's investment is also protected. The results, of course, it gives us peace of mind. So, why do insurance companies offer property insurance? Certainly not as a public service. Just like any other company, they're in business to make a profit. As the risks go up, insurance premiums either get more expensive, so profits margins are maintained, or they stop selling it altogether. And we know in many parts of the country and probably around the world where they offer it, property insurance has already reached unaffordable levels. So, what do insurance companies know? Well, they know that the risks for insuring property is going up in time. And some of it is going up due to inflation, materials, labor costs increasing, and some of it is self-inflicted. The recent increase in tariffs is an example of that. So in 2024, the U.S. was hit with a $27 billion price tag for weather-related disasters that when all the damages were included, that total rose to 183 billion in charges. And of course, much of that was the responsibility of insurance companies to cover. We all know about the climate disasters that happened in many states like Texas, California, Florida, North Carolina, the Midwest, and so on, just to name a few. So clearly the risk has been going up with time for all these reasons. So the reason the risks are going up are several fold. Of course, we all know about climate change. When I was growing up, it was a very rare occurrence for a whole community to be destroyed in fire or be inundated by floods or suffer the consequences of severe droughts. Population density and environmental factors were very difficult back then than they are in the present time. For those of you who have mainly only been around for 20 or 30 years or so, you may not realize the extent of the change that has occurred in the last half century or more. So, in addition to the increase in each one of these challenges, the challenges are converging and they're interacting with each other, and more are likely to converge sooner than later and in this century. And now, in many parts of the country, these challenges are all becoming commonplace. Just take a look at a close look at the news and see what's reported. Seems like almost on a daily basis. So why? One of the reasons for these challenges that they are converging is because of the fact that the Earth is a closed system. And in a closed system, which is finite in terms of the total resources available, continuous growth is not sustainable. Whether it's unconstrained population growth, eventually you run out of resources. Even our economic systems are based on a model of growth year by year, and the competitive nature of the capitalist society requires continuous evolution, innovation, and planned obsolescence. Things have a given lifetime so they can sell you the next latest version. Perfect example of that is how often do you really need to buy a new cell phone? Do you really take advantage of all those new features that come out every single year? So because of the issues, we're now bumping up against resource shortages for the first time in human history, and a clash between those that have and those that don't. And of course, we also have a lot of people that don't understand, are oblivious, and are just not taking some of the threats that civilization faces very serious. Here's an example of a devastation that took place in the past summer in California, where a literal whole community was destroyed because of heat wave that caused a drought, which made the forest in which this town was embedded very susceptible to a fire, which not only took out the entire forest, but took out all the houses within that forest as well. So here's another example of a Florida hurricane damage. And of course, you've all heard about that. It's been in the news many times. So let's take a closer look at some of the interconnected global crises. I'm not going to spend much time talking about climate change. You know some of the effects of climate change. And if you dig into detail, you will see that there's a lot of other effects as well that are happening. Just to give you one brief example, as the climate heats up, water vapor from the ground evaporates more rapidly. And if it doesn't rain often, it's difficult for plants to get the moisture they need to have adequate growth. So that's just one simple example. There are many, many others that I could talk about, but that's really beyond the scope of this presentation. Another area that we're seem to be more concerned about lately are the increasing tensions between nuclear armed states. Just very recently, within last week, India and Pakistan seem to be on the verge of war, and both of those countries have nuclear weapons. Not a pleasant scenario. Israel, who has come close to the brink several times, thinking that its existence is at stake, you know, is known to have nuclear weapons, and I don't know if they're using that as a deterrent against Iran, but I'm sure Iran knows the possibility if they go beyond the red line, whatever it might be. And of course, then we have what's going on in Western Europe with Ukraine and Russia. And we have sides right now, the United States, France, United Kingdom on one side, and Russia, China, North Korea, and um, uh, I guess on the other side. So, um, very unpleasant situation. Let's hope that this one never comes about. Okay. Another area that people have concern about is artificial intelligence. We hear more and more about job displacements and inequalities due to automation. And of course, AI is not being used in commercial environments, it's also being used by the military. And do we have all the controls in place to make sure that AI doesn't do something that is not humanity is not aware of, and it literally causes all kinds of destruction? Um, we recently have come out of the COVID pandemic, and it's pretty clear now from all the evidence that it was in fact a leakage from a lab in Wuhan, China, which was doing research on gain of function. In other words, trying to make a virus more viral. Again, how many countries around the world, the United States, Russia, China, and who knows what other nation states also have programs for biological weapons? What is the possibility that they may get loose? Bacteria and viruses know no country boundaries, as we saw with the COVID situation. Okay. A few more crises or challenges that I'd like to talk about. The global democratic backsliding and polarizations that are occurring now, partly because of the political instability around the world, partly because of disinformation, and lots of other reasons. We see the rise of authoritarian rule. And of course, in those cases, it's the whim of the one person who's running things that's more important than the well-being of the entire population of the country. A good example is Putin and his desires to, gain some additional geography from an adjacent state, namely Ukraine. Of course, disinformation has also weakened the trust that the populations around the world have had in science and institutions. It gets to the point where it's so bad in some cases that people don't know what to believe anymore, and consequently, they don't pay attention to anything. Okay. Another concern that we've never had to deal with before deals with cybersecurity. Whether it's a nation state, or terrorist group, or just some criminal organization, uh, these actors are weaponizing cyberspace. It is well known that they have been trying to attack and infiltrate critical infrastructure and hold these nation states. And ransom, if they don't pay up, they get their entire energy grid destroyed. And that's not a far-fetched scenario, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So there clearly is a widening gap between the rich and the poor, both within and between countries. I believe it's less than 0.1% owns almost 40% of the world's riches now. And of course, in my own country, in the United States, we have a lot of very wealthy people buying up most of the farmland in the country, destroying farms that have been in families for centuries, if not decades. And of course, I'm sure you've all heard about the tensions around the world that are increasing over fights for resources, water in particular, and arable land. As the temperature increases around the world, those become more important. And in geographic areas where they aren't blessed with adequate rainfall, they become a very serious problem. Um, the economic inequality and resource scarcity has also partially been blamed for the potential mass migrations that have taken place in the Middle East. Syria is an excellent example of that because of a drought that extended over several years. Farmers who made a subsistence living on their farms eventually had to give up farming because of continuous droughts, migrated to the cities. And of course, the government of Syria was not adequately equipped to deal with all those people living in the city, and no jobs were available, which led to civil unrest. And of course, mass migrations, will not be bound by any so-called country barriers. If people are having trouble surviving, they will always find a way to migrate to geographic locations that are more suitable for their future existence. Of course, another thing that's relatively new in the 21st century is risk from space and extraterrestrial things like asteroids and meteors. We know, for example, that NASA has been tracking an asteroid that probably will likely strike Earth or come very close to Earth in 2032. Uh, and of course, with the kinetic energy of such an impact, it will destroy large parts of the surface of the Earth. And of course, with all the debris that's now in space and the militarization of space, one never knows whether or not a risk might pop up in a place that was never before considered to be such. So when you take all these processes together, or even some of them in particular, like climate change, um, you have the possibility of a runaway effect where the system feeds on itself. And it's a process that amplifies or increases the effects of small disturbances within the system, leading to greater changes in the same direction. A thermostat is an excellent example of negative feedback. The heating and cooling cycles. When you set your heater in the wintertime to 70 degrees, let's say, and the temperature falls below 70 degrees, your furnace comes on and raises the temperature in the house, goes in the opposite direction in which the temperature was moving within the house. Um, the same thing is true in the summertime with air conditioning. Now imagine that somebody reversed the heating and cooling wires in your thermostat. So now in the summertime, when the temperature got warmer, instead of the air conditioner came on, the heater came on, or vice versa. Um, that's an example of positive feedback loop where a small increase in change leads to greater increases in the same direction. So positive feedback is very dangerous. And as we'll talk shortly, that's certainly happening in our environment today, which is one of the reasons that climate change is such a tremendous challenge for humanity. I'll give you one example while we're on the page. If you look here, you have ice floating on the ocean, especially in the polar regions. Now, ice has a high albedo, which means it reflects most of the sun's energy back into space. However, as the planet warms, ice tends to melt, exposing the dark surfaces, whether it be ocean water underneath or solid ground under the ice on land. Instead of reflecting back to space, now the sun's heat will be absorbed, further increasing the warming. That's just one example of many positive feedback loops that are currently occurring because of climate change. We'll have more to say about others in the future. So when you have all these extensive interactive systems and widespread feedback and feed-forward loops, you have extreme sensitivity to small fluctuations. And the outcomes from all these interactions are impossible to predict. And living creatures will have great difficulty adapting. Evolution has given us the ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions, but historically on planet Earth, these have always taken place over geological time frame. So living creatures have plenty of time to adapt to changing conditions, except of course for a rare occurrence like meteor impact or something like that. But for the most part, living creatures had no difficulty adapting. But when you have rapid change, humanity and most living creatures, whether it be plant or animal, are not equipped to react quickly to survive. So in chaotic evolution, no matter what the initial state of the system, it's impossible to predict how the system will evolve. But you can't ever know the initial conditions or all the interacting conditions perfectly enough. The only thing you can do is actually let the system play out. That in technical jargon is called, it's non-computational. The only way you find out what's going to happen is let it play out. You can make some educated guesses, but you never know for sure or with certainty what's going to happen. So here's a summary of all the major influences on the Earth's biosphere that are interacting right now. The more interacting factors, the more difficult it is to predict when we reach a critical tipping point, and we certainly have no shortage of them now. Climate extremes, including heat waves, crop failures, river floods, tropical cyclones, wildfires and droughts, hurricanes will all increase in frequency and intensity with continued atmospheric warming. The global average temperatures are rising at unprecedented rates due to greenhouse gases, and children born in 2020 will probably face 2 to 7 times more extreme climate events than those that were born in 1960. So, the Earth is a complex interactive system. I already mentioned one example of how climate change causes sea ice to melt, which causes more of the sun's energy to be absorbed, which speeds up the heating. Another example is if you have a snow-covered mountaintop with more heating in the atmosphere, the ice melts faster. And you may recall that most of the sources of rivers and streams throughout the world is from the reservoirs of water in the form of frozen ice and snow on the top of these mountains. As the amount of snow and ice recedes or melts quicker than normal, these rivers and lakes tend to reduce in flow or even dry up completely during periods of drought. And certainly when the water is needed most in the heat of the summer, it may no longer be available. Of course, when you reduce the flow in the rivers, you also reduce the groundwater, especially if the rain cycle is also reduced, and that causes wells to dry up as well. So not a very pleasant scenario. We have similar scenarios with all these other things that we could go into in great detail, and I leave it to you, the viewer, to investigate some of the things that you may be particularly interested in. So all of these things not only cause positive feedback loops within themselves, but they're also creating interactive systems. A good example of that is a nuclear threat. God forbid if we ever see anything like that in our lifetime, it's projected that the dust clouds that go up into the atmosphere will shield the sunlight to the point that much of the plant life on the planet will die off for several years until the dust finally settles back to the ground after a nuclear holocaust where everybody unleashes their store of weapons. So, there are many other examples I can give, but I think you get the point. So, years ago, I came across the book called Future Shock by Alvin Toffler. This book had a great influence on many people. It was an international bestseller for several years, sold over 6 million copies, and was widely translated into many languages. Within the book, he talked about the predictions caused by the effects of rapid technological change. Toffler urged readers to adapt thoughtfully and navigate the complexities ahead because of this rapid change. And the book ended acknowledging the inevitability of change while stressing the urgency of understanding its impact. His book captured a sense of a pending crisis regarding a collective ability to cope with such rapid change. And combating this requires a collective acknowledgement of all the challenges and intricacies of humanity's rapidly evolving existence. One of the things that he did to forecast the future was he looked at newspaper headings and other news magazines from around the world to predict trends. So I've always remembered that lesson, and I was on Flipboard, which is an online news magazine, which is a compendium from news articles from newspapers and magazines from around the world. And this was some of the headlines on the climate issues that were published in Flipboard on April 30th of 2025. You can see there's a lot of articles about climate issues. They don't make front page news. They aren't on the mainstream media on the evening news. They're relegated to page 15 or 16 for whatever reason. But if you look, you will always find that these warnings are getting louder and more frequent. They are out there. You just need to move beyond the headlines to see the concern that is now being raised by so many people. So, interesting enough, one of the articles that was on Flipboard on that day was an article about the United States, various states facing extreme weather conditions by 2030. I have the URL on the top of the page, which actually illustrates the article that was published by Fox Weather Department. And here's a list, a number of states. There was actually a paragraph for each one of these states describing in more detail the likelihood of extreme weather and what impacts it might have on that state. And of course, These aren't the only states that can expect extreme weather. All the states adjacent to these states listed can probably experience similar, as nature doesn't know anything about state boundaries. So, my question today is humanity surrendering to existential threats? Why aren't these challenges covered on front page news? In 2020, during the election cycle, you heard some politicians talking about climate change and the issues associated with it. Today, not so much. Have we lost interest? There are ever more articles in the news these days, but they're always relegated to page 15 and beyond, as I indicated early. Are there just too many overstated threats? Is it too difficult for humanity to deal with, as Alvin Toffler has suggested? Is it too expensive to deal with these threats? Are there too many vested interests? Is it too overwhelming to deal with? Is there just too much information and you can't distinguish fact from fiction? Is it too far in the future to worry about? What about too many ordinary people just don't care? They're too busy just getting about their daily life and putting food on the table and being able to pay this month's rent. And what about our politicians and our so-called political leaders? They just don't seem to care and are more interested in short-term vested interests. And by the way, I would suggest to you also that political leaders are not really leaders at all. And so true with the politicians. They're just followers. They follow the desires and the whims of the general population. So it's really up to the general population to make enough noise to get the political leaders to pay attention to the issues that really need attention. Okay, well, that does it for right now. We will continue this presentation in part two. I hope I've given you the background for what you need to know about the challenges that we face. In the next part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about what the scenarios are for the future and what the possibilities are of avoiding them. I hope you will stay tuned for that, and I will put in the corner of the screen the link to the second part of this video. Okay. I hope you enjoyed this and it was informative, and you will come back for part two. See you shortly.